Okay. Let's just fucking finish this shit. Okay. I didn't watch every movie in this tier. I watched a few things, and then I'll say what I watched when I get into it. But for the most part, it's reached the point where it's like I'm just not having fun anymore, and so I'm not gonna subject myself to outright torture. you know. Before it was fun. It was fun torture. It was like, ooh, I'm torturing. It was like fun still, even though it was like not dramatic. Dramatic's a strong word. But now it's reached the point where it's like it's like when you watch these, like, so many of these movies all at once, it becomes more and more depressing when you look at like the dark side of humanity. Does that make sense? It's actually it's really interesting to look into the research behind this tier specifically. The other ones, the other tiers have like cool backstories or whatever, and you get a good, this tier gives you a good movie history lesson. So let's have a brief history lesson. Likely if you're watching this, you know what snuff films are. Snuff films has been a legend that's been around since about 1976. The word snuff comes from a movie that was released in 1976, directed by Michael Finley and Carter Stevens. To snuff as in to a life being snuffed out like a candle. The movie is a fictional story that includes raw footage of what was sold to audiences as a real murder on camera, a grim document from the underground snuff industry. The footage was fake, and once again, a cynical gimmick to draw the attention of the media and the public. The actual gore in the movie Snuff is very cheesy, very obviously fake, but at the time, a lot of people believed it. Snuff led to video nasties. Video nasties are movies that were circulated in the 1980s that were typically low budget, distributed on video cassettes, and were known for being low budget horror or exploitation films. But all of this originated from the movie Snuff. Mondo Cane films became like an AU in fanfiction terms, literally so famous that there's subgenres. See Mondo Elvis, Mondo Tino, Mondo Rocco, and Mondo Sex. Mondo Cane, literally translating to doggish world or dog world, a mild Italian profanity, is a 1962 Italian Mondo documentary film directed by the trio Gualtiero Jacopetti, Paolo Cavara, and Franco E. Prosperi, with narration by Stefano Sibaldi. The film consists of a series of travelogue scenes that provide glimpses into cultural practices around the world with the intention to shock or surprise Western film audiences. These scenes are presented with little continuity, as they are intended as a kaleidoscopic display of shocking content rather than presenting a structured argument. Despite its claims of genuine documentation, certain scenes are either staged or creatively manipulated to enhance this effect. An article on Variety said, "Yet the total effect is grimly stimulating from the visual standpoint, depressing in the conclusions drawn. Whether one sides with his views or not, Gualtiero Jacopetti deserves credit for a shattering view of the world. The directors are surrounded by quite a bit of controversy, from things as small as being accused of faking scenes for their movies, to accusations that Jacopetti conspired with mercenaries to arrange killings for the camera. Jacopetti and Prosperi kept that message going with Mondo sequels and spin-offs that included Mondo Cane 2, which contains the only scene they admit to faking, a recreation of the self-immolation of Vietnamese monk Thick Quang Duc, and Africa Addio, which we'll get to, is also on this tier, whose on-screen executions led some to accuse Jacopetti of conspiring with mercenaries to arrange a camera-friendly killing. Jacopetti and Prosperi parted ways after Goodbye Uncle Tom, which made no pretenses to reality and used Mondo Cane-like scenes to depict life in the antebellum American South, filmed in Duvalier-era Haiti. The excerpts featured in The Godfathers of Mondo, with their images of roughly handled children and underage nudity, made it look as cruel and exploitative as any of the pair's documentaries. Mondo Cane is essentially the grandfather of a good chunk of this genre. Mondo Cane is also the grandfather of the Faces of Death series. It appears the original meaning of Mondo Cane was just life. The movie itself contains various scenes mainly dedicated to animal death and sexuality, but there are more meaningful scenes as well, such as one scene of indigenous tribes in Papua New Guinea attending Catholic church services, and another of residents in Hawaii throwing leis at tourists visiting. I watched this one, and for the time, I suppose this movie was very shocking. As it stands compared to the other movies on this list, I don't find it disturbing in the slightest. I suppose because it's the grandfather of all of these movies that adds meaning to it being here. But as it stands, it's not, the most disturbing thing I've ever seen. Africa Addio. Okay, this one was surrounded by way more controversy. Africa Addio, or Africa Blood and Guts, released in 1966, directed by Gualtiero Jacopetti and Franco Prosperi. This shocking documentary chronicles the violence that occurred in much of the African continent during the 1960s. As many of the countries in Africa were transitioning from colonial rule to other forms of government, there were often violent political upheavals. The film shows clips of revolutions in Zanzibar and Kenya, in which thousands were killed. The violence is not only political, there is also extensive footage of hunters and poachers slaughtering different types of wild animals. Released in 1966, this was directed by the same guys who directed Mondo Cane 4 years previous, Gualtiero Jacopetti and Franco Prosperi. There's a lot of allegations of racism surrounding this one, and I'll just read you the movie's opening narration to give you an idea of that. Europe has abandoned her baby, the narrator mourns, just when it needs her the most. Who has taken over, now that the colonialists have left? The advertising spells it out for us. Raw, wild, brutal, modern-day savages. Europe is in a hurry to leave, and on tiptoe even if, all things considered, it has given far more than it has taken. Europe, the continent that nursed Africa, can no longer manage this big black baby that grew too quickly, keeps bad company, and what's more, hates it because of its white skin, and so it is abandoned, still cranky and immature, just at the moment when it needs Europe the most. Fuck. Damn. This one was rough. So the guys who directed Mondo Cane and this one have faced many controversies throughout the years, from faking footage to the standard you would expect. There are scenes where they essentially witness these horrible things happening, and then comes the age-old question of, the new age question as of television is, at what point do you step in as a cameraman when you witness something horrible happening? Africa Addio includes footage of the Civil War in Congo, the final days of colonial rule in Kenya, revolutions in Angola, and the Zanzibar Revolution, which included the massacre of 1964, which claimed the lives of approximately 5,000 Arab and South Asian civilians. Estimates range up to 20,000 in the aftermath, as well as the aftermath of the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, European descent settler exodus from White Highlands area. Also features racial and tribal violence in Dar es Salaam, the Hutu violence against the Rwandan Tutsi, aftermath of a battle between government soldiers and rebel insurgents in Stanleyville, Congo, and the mass slaughter of endangered animals in game enclaves. And here's where it gets to the controversy. Prior to the film's release, allegations that a scene depicting the execution of a Congolese Simba rebel had been staged for the camera resulted in co-director Gualtiero Jacopetti's arrest on charges of murder. The film's footage was seized by police, and the editing process was halted during the legal proceedings. He was acquitted after he and co-director Franco Prosperi produced documents proving they had arrived at the scene just before the execution took place. Jacopetti has stated that all images in the film are real and that nothing was ever staged. In the documentary, The Grandfathers of Mondo, the co-directors stressed that the only scenes they ever staged were in Mondo Cane 2. In the same documentary, Prospero described their filmmaking philosophy: slip in, ask, never pay, never reenact. The film has appeared in a number of different versions. The Italian and French versions were edited and were provided with narration by Jacopetti himself. The American version, with the explicitly shocking title Africa, Blood and Guts, was re-released in 1970 by Jerry Gross's company, Cinemation Industries, and had 40 minutes cut out, mainly traces of political context, and was edited and translated without the approval of Jacopetti. Indeed, the differences are such that Jacopetti has called this film a betrayal of the original idea. So, I didn't watch this one because of the subject matter. I was never in the headspace for it. So, this movie is basically just a racist depiction of Africa, war, and animal deaths, which is unfortunate because I feel like this definitely could have been one of the more meaningful movies on this list. Even. Faces of Death, released in 1978, is an American Mondo horror film written and directed by John Allen Schwartz, credited under the pseudonyms Conan LeCelaire and Alan Black. This film, shown in a documentary-like style, centers on pathologist Francis B. Gross, played by actor Michael Carr. The narrator presents the viewer with a variety of footage showing different gruesome ways of dying from a variety of sources. Faces of Death was released in Japan in 1978 under the title Junk and was an immediate hit, but would soon find cult status worldwide a few years later thanks to the invention of the VCR. Horror exploitation films began to circulate in the early 1980s by the name of video nasties, one of the most popular being our own Faces of Death. The film has faced a lot of controversy, from being banned outright in Great Britain to being named the scapegoat for a 1986 murder by 14-year-old Rod Matthews, who said Faces of Death led him to commit the murder. An article says, "When I pressed LeCelaire on this, though, he wavers. I don't believe it's my fault," he says, then pauses. "Maybe it is. I'd hate to think that." Nothing, he adds, could have been further from his desire. "What was your desire then?" I ask. "To shock people," he says. There was also another legal case where a teacher showed his class Faces of Death, and two of the girls ended up being so traumatized by what they witnessed that they told their families, and their families sued the school. They ended up settling for $100,000 combined. The content of the movie is made up of about half of the footage being faked content. Probably the most iconic is the scene of a monkey being beaten to death, and then its killers eating its brains, a scene that was referenced in an Indiana Jones movie. Other scenes include an autopsy, suicide, sheep on meat hooks, electrocution, etc. Traces of Death, directed by Damon Fox. Traces of Death is a 1993 Mondo shockumentary that consists of various scenes of stock footage depicting death and real scenes of violence. Traces of Death goes the same route as the rest of the movies on this list, tying the satanic heavy metal to depictions of violence. Traces of Death depicts actual scenes of death and violence, from Bud Dwyer's suicide to a man, Pitt Durnitz, being eaten alive by lions in front of his family, footage of dead children, and more. Okay, so Faces of Death actually was very inspiring in this genre in the same way that Mondo Cane was, meaning that there were a lot of movies that came as a result of that one. And Traces of Death is one of those sequels. Junk Films, released in 2008, directed by Kiyotaka Tsurisaki. Junk Films is a collection of short documentaries pondering about the meaning of life and death by the use of shocking images. Kiyotaka is primarily a photographer, specializing in recording death. As a filmmaker, he takes more or less the same approach as he does as a photographer, traveling the world as a war photographer. Only, he's not interested in the fighting, but in the results after the battle, and the bodies of those who didn't survive. Bazaar magazine said, "As a photographer in a crowded industry, finding your own niche might be a difficult task. For artist Tsurisaki Kiyotaka, a request to shoot a dead body for an S&M magazine has turned into a prolific career that has seen him photographing more than 1,000 corpses in some of the world's most volatile areas. Tsurisaki has published 6 books, two of which, Revelations, a 12-year anthology of his corpse shots, and Requiem de la Rue Morgue, have been released in France. But while there is a voyeuristic element of shock and gore value, the photos are strangely compelling. Portrait-like, still life, or journalistic reportage, each corpse bearing testimony to a tragedy. Originally I said nothing particularly interesting about this one, just images of people dying, but after some thought, I don't know, I can kind of see the appeal. It's something strangely fascinating, right? Death and the horrors of humanity are something that's fascinating though, right? Like, that's why you're all listening to this right now. That's certainly why I started watching in the first place, was because there was something fascinating about it. I can see the appeal. I can't say that I watched it or that I ever will watch it, but I get the appeal. Orozco the Embalmer, released in 2001, directed by Kiyotaka Tsurisaki, the same guy we just talked about. This is a documentary. It follows the Colombian embalmer named Froilan Orozco Duarte, who is shown living in El Cartucho, an impoverished and crime-ridden area of Bogota, Colombia, where the homicide rate is high and corpses can be seen on the streets. The film comprises footage taken over a period of several years, documenting in a graphic cinema verite manner Orozco's embalming of corpses. Orozco died during the production of this film. The reviews of this one are pretty positive, and I was actually almost intrigued enough to watch this one purely because of how positive it was. A lot of people were saying it was almost heartwarming how he takes care of the bodies of loved ones for loved ones. Oh, and I looked into Kiyotaka, and he was also known for porn. The reviews are pretty good for this movie, but I swear to God, you cannot find a single in-depth review of this without snapshots of the gore, which I'm just not in the headspace right now to deal with. It's one of those movies I think I will watch one day, just not today, you know? This one actually really intrigued me. A lot of the reviews hold this one in pretty high regards in terms of heart. Buried in the Sand, released in 2004, directed by David Wald. Buried in the Sand, The Deception of America. And for this one I just said propaganda, ? Conservative political commentator Mark Taylor presents uncensored archival footage of graphic Iraqi and Middle East atrocities in an effort to justify American intervention, just like a political shockumentary. None of the reviews say anything special about it other than it somehow has less of the charm of Africa Addio, which, whoa, you gotta be pretty racist. Death File Red, released in 1994, directed by Susumu Saigusa. The 9th film of a popular shock series, Death File Red, is the compilation of clips put together with a narration describing what's going on without any commentary, featuring gore and depravity the world over in similar Mondo film fashion. Really, there seems nothing particularly unique about this one, other than it being less intense than the other movies on this tier. It's also the name of a death metal band. When I searched that, the band came up, so give the band a listen or something. Banned from Television, released in 1998, directed by Joe Francis. Okay, this one, probably one of the more interesting ones on this tier. Okay. A series of videos containing footage of real-life events that were too disturbing for television. The director has some kind of shit going on. I don't know. He also created the Girls Gone Wild franchise, if literally anybody gives a shit. He stopped the Banned series after 3 movies because apparently he found them too disturbing to watch back to back. Imagine. And I'm going to read his Wikipedia page because it's actually really interesting. Francis had a sex tape that was leaked. Francis had, at various times, been convicted of tax evasion, bribery, false imprisonment, assault causing great bodily injury, dissuading a witness, and record-keeping violations, and has pleaded no contest to child abuse and prostitution. In January 2011, Francis brought a group of 3 women to his home, leading to 5 charges, 3 misdemeanor counts of false imprisonment, 1 of assault causing great bodily injury, and 1 of dissuading a witness. In May 6th, 2013, Francis was convicted on all 5 charges. He faced a maximum of 5 years in prison and or $13,000 in fines. On May 22nd, Francis did an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, calling the jurors mentally ... retarded and suggesting they should be euthanized. He later apologized for his remarks, but stated that he had been manipulated by the media. In 2004, Riley Perez, also known as Darnell Riley, broke into Francis's home where he filmed a humiliating blackmail video and arranged for payment so that the video did not go viral. Held at gunpoint, Francis was forced to disrobe on camera. Riley has claimed that he was asked to do so by mafia criminals. Jesus Christ, this guy's life. As for the movie, the reviews are scathing. Tornadoes on Rate Your Music back in 2014 said, "This is a pretty half-assed collection with lame and inconsistent narration. The video quality ranges from mediocre to awful, and it was seemingly assembled from scenes that were rejected by prior like-minded shockumentaries. The closing train accident scene is really disturbing, but that's the only thing that's worth mentioning. There's also some pointless Mardi Gras exhibitionism thrown into the mix, which clearly should have been reserved for those intolerable Girls Gone Wild videos instead. Skip this unless you're particularly desperate." Jesus. Oh, what a life. Black Metal Veins, released in 2012, directed by our old buddy, Lucifer Valentine. Obviously, even if I had watched every other movie on this list, I wouldn't have watched this one, because of Lucifer Valentine. 5 heroin junkies experience psychological, physiological, and spiritual destruction as the addiction decays their bodies and minds. It's believed the majority of the footage from this movie was staged. Valentine confirmed the girl's death at the end was faked. Most reviews I've seen of this movie were pretty positive, which I know it's crazy, but I don't believe that. I firmly believe this movie was shit. This one I won't watch based purely on principle. I hate the director. Watch my other video where I talk about why. Cuevos de Morte, released in 2006, translates to Archives of Death. It appears this one is just Spanish Faces of Death. Standard shockumentary. But its unique factor is a lot of dead kids and an abortion, supposedly. But I don't know what that means. Like, the abortion action? Or the aborted fetus? I don't know. A lot of the websites were just in Spanish. And if you start to dig too hard on a lot of these movies, you start to see some shit. So I didn't dig too hard. The Dark Side of the Porn, which is a show released in 2005, directed by a different person each episode, and narrated by fucking Doctor Who, Christopher Eccleston. What the fuck? This one, I'd say if you're interested in the history of Mondo films, disturbing movies, video nasties, this one is more interesting to watch because it kind of goes into the detail. It goes into the history of it all. I actually recommend this one, honestly. I did watch it and I did like it. So, check it out. Okay, that is the 6th tier of this list done. That leaves 2 more. So, I think it's a given that for the rest of this list, I will not be watching the other ones because as I have done no research into the latter tiers, I'm still not sure whether or not illegal content is actually been depicted. So I will research and I'll see you guys whenever I see you.